All right, everybody, it's time for another Datasheet deep dive. And this time, we're going to be putting on our brown coats, heading down to Serenity Valley to fight against the Glorious Alliance, because we're talking about the Firestrike Servo-Turret. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name, as always, is Trevi, and welcome back to another Datasheet deep dive. This time around, we're going to be playing some tower defense because we're talking about the Firestrike Turret, this weird thing that's come out in the last iteration of Space Marines. A little bit of an oddball pick in the Space Marine Army, but we'll talk about that as we get deeper into the video. Today, as always, we're going to be doing an in-depth overview of the stat line of the Firestrike Servo-Turret. We're going to be talking about some combos, and especially some sub-faction benefits that you can use along with this thing to make the most use out of it in your Space Marine army. And at the end, we're going to render a final verdict on the Servo-Turret and compare it to some other options in the Space Marine faction. Before we get into the video, I just want to drop a quick reminder, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button down below. And if you like these Datasheet deep dives, it's still a bit of an experimental format for the channel, so any feedback in likes or comments that you can give helps let me know that this kind of video is something that you like to see. Alright, so with the housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about the Firestrike Servo-Turret datasheet. Firstly, the Servo-Turret is a heavy support choice. This is a very important battlefield role, and the reason for which I'll talk about in a second. It comes in at 6 power level or 90 points with its stock loadout. Now, I will mention there is a little bit of confusion with this datasheet. You can see on the datasheet here that the stock loadout is equipped with the Twin Las Talon, but when you go down to the points section, it assumes that you've equipped it with an Accelerator autocannon. That's because the Accelerator autocannon is the cheaper option, so it offers you the Las Talon as an upgrade. It is an additional cost to equip the Las Talon, even though it says it's already equipped in the original datasheet. Also, the picture has the autocannon, so that's even more confusing. The base weapon, the Accelerator autocannon, is a heavy 6, which is pretty impressive. Strength 7, AP 1, 2 flat damage at a 48-inch range, pretty stock standard autocannon profile, and that's pretty solid. I mean, 6 shots at an autocannon profile is nothing to shake a stick at. That'll pull off a Primaris Marine or 2 out of a unit every time it goes to shoot. The Las Talon is even more interesting. It's only a 24-inch range, heavy 4, but at a Las Cannon profile, it's a strength 9, AP 3, D6 damage. Where things get really wonky is the stat block of the Servo-Turret. The first thing you'll notice is that it is move 3. That's very slow. It may, in fact, be the slowest move in the game. I didn't check, but I don't think anything moves slower than 3 inches that actually has a movement value and isn't immobile. Now, the fact that this thing has a movement value at all surprised a lot of people because it just looks like a stationary object. It talks about in the background that it uses like a grav plate to lift itself up and move around. That kind of reminds me of the shade turrets in Halo that, like, when you get into them, they would float up so you could rotate them, which I thought was like kind of a cool visual. I sort of wish that was represented on the model. It's just sitting on the ground in the model. It does come in at a pretty startlingly good ballistic skill of 2+. That's because it has a Tech Marine manning it, and those the guys are generally 2+ ballistic skill. It's also toughness 5 wounds. It has 2 attacks from the dude in the seat punching you, and a 2+ armor save, which is pretty important. So the big highliners here: 2+ ballistic skill, 2+ armor. Those are 2 excellent stats to have. The downside is toughness 5 wounds, and as we'll talk about in a sec, the vehicle keyword, which is actually kind of a drawback in this case. Not to mention 3-inch movement. That is abysmally terrible. Unfortunately, 40K, and especially 9th edition 40K, is very much a movement-oriented game, and you want to be able to move to objectives, to take them over, and score primary objective points so you don't lose. And unfortunately, the Firestrike Servo-Turret can't really do that. In addition, there's no way to increase its speed. You could advance it, obviously, and there are some stratagems that you can use on it. And what your opponent's just going to do, as soon as you put any number of these things on the table, is just deploy out of their line of sight, and it has no recourse against that. It's just going to slowly trek across the table and hopefully one day sort of get a lateral line of sight across the side of a building or something. One thing to think of in 40K is that, especially if you're playing on a decent terrain table with a lot of line of sight blocking terrain, your movement is very important for getting lines of fire around pieces of terrain. That is something that the Servo-Turret does not do. It picks a line of fire and it mostly stays there for the entirety of the game. And if your opponent just doesn't move into its line of sight, I mean, it doesn't do anything. You spent 90 points on nothing, which is pretty unfortunate. The defensive profile, despite that 2-up save, is also relatively disappointing. Only 5 wounds is pretty easy to get through. I mean, this thing could die to a single las cannon shot, which is a little annoying for almost 100-point single model. It has the vehicle keyword. That means that if you're bringing any other vehicles in your list, your opponent is incentivized to take Bring It Down as a secondary objective, and that means that these Firestrike Servo-Turrets, each individual one will give up 2 points for Bring It Down. So that's it's a little frustrating for just a random unit. Space Marines have a lot of sort of meaty individual model units that they can bring. We just talked about Invader ATVs in a previous video. Those are a great example of that. They can be a single model unit, but they're 8 wounds and they're extremely fast. And so in comparison, this Firestrike Servo-Turret, while being more expensive, is a lot less exciting. And ATV does not have that vehicle keyword, so it will never give up points on a secondary objective, besides, I guess, attrition, but that doesn't usually really matter. It also has the artillery keyword, which sounds like a cool keyword, but unfortunately it's a straight up debuff. It's actually just a drawback. Artillery itself doesn't come with any additional rules baggage, except a lot of stratagems interact disfavorably with it. For example, a bunch of the White Scar stratagems, Strike for the Heart and Encirclement specifically, specify that they cannot be used on artillery units, which I think is basically just the Thunderfire Cannon and this thing. This actually sucks, because Encirclement would actually be a really cool stratagem to use on these guys, but unfortunately you can't do that. So it just has a keyword that is just anti-synergistic with the rest of the army. While we're talking about keywords, I just mentioned that it uses, in the background, gravity plates to hover above the ground and move itself around. For that reason, it's weird it doesn't have the repulsor field keyword, so it doesn't have access to Grav Pulse. I actually think that would have been a really cool include. That would give it the ability to fall back and shoot, which it doesn't have. Obviously, it's a vehicle, so it can shoot while it's in melee, but falling back and shooting would be cool because it has basically no melee damage output to speak of. And it would be -2 to be charged, which makes it so that if you're using it to zone out Deep Strikers or something like that, it could be even more useful. You can sort of see that we're coming down a little bit negative on this profile so far. Now, you can run this in a unit of 1, 2, or 3. I do think that it's basically either going to be 1 or it's going to be 3, and I think almost 100% of the time I would not bring 3 of these. You're locking together a unit of them into this 3-inch movement, and they don't have any vehicle squadron rule, so they don't split once they're deployed, so all of them have to move together in a brick. Your opponent is already incentivized to hide from this thing, and putting 3 of them in a unit for 270 points before upgrading them, remember, it's just going to be more points into a unit that your opponent can easily escape from. So I would not take more than 1. Now, I do think a unit of 1 does have some merit, just as kind of a backline babysitter. You can stick 1 on an objective. It doesn't die trivially. It's not like a unit of servitors or something like that, a single Thunderfire Cannon shot or some random bolters are going to kill. This thing does require your opponent to focus on it a little bit to take down that 2+ save, and it can just act as another model, sitting on that objective and holding it, and contributing some firepower whenever it can. So I do think that 90% of the situations that you're going to be bringing this thing in, it's going to be units of 1. Now, which gun would you equip this unit with? I think almost 100% of the time I would be equipping it with the base accelerator autocannon. Unfortunately, we just harped on how much that 3-inch move sucks, and sticking a range 24 gun on top of that means that it is even easier for your opponent to escape its, damage, because they can just stand 28 inches away, and it only threats 27 inches. 27 inches is slower than an Eradicator. So you're just spending points to basically make this thing shoot less often, which sucks. The autocannon profile is not terrible, and it has a 48-inch range, so that ensures that if this thing has line of sight to something, it can basically always shoot it, which is nice. Not to mention the fact that it's also 40 points less expansive. This Las Talon upgrade is 40 extra points. It makes this single 5-wound model cost as much as a character, 130 points, which is too many. It's too many points. That's too many. I think 90 already is cutting it a little close. 130 for a single model that very rarely gets to shoot is way too many points. So I would almost always take the accelerator autocannons. That said, I think there's one instance where you would want to take the Las Talons and where it could be cool. I'm not going to say that it's sort of competitively viable, but if you really want to put a whole bunch of Firestrike Servo-Turrets on the table, there might be one way to do that. And I think that would be to strategic reserve them. Now, I mentioned before that Encirclement, the White Scar's ability to basically strategic reserve a unit, it does not work on these guys, which sucks, because that was almost the first place I went to, because I love encircling these big beefy models with short range weapons. Unfortunately, it specifies non-artillery, so you can't do that, but the standard strategic reserve rule does not. So You could take, a unit of 3, or you could stack up a bunch of individuals to strategic reserve them. You could equip them with Las Talons, so that 24-inch range, you can get within that 24-inch range, and you can pop them off the sides and hit your opponent with these really powerful ranged attacks. Obviously, 3 of these things shooting 12 strength 9 shots is like, at ballistic skill 2, is pretty good. It's not amazing because the points trade-off is not that great, but I mean, that's a lot of blast cannon shots. And your opponent, there's basically no recourse to it. Your opponent just has to eat it because they can't shoot you first. And they have a tough time escaping your line of sight because you can just put them on the table wherever they have line of sight to something good. Like I said before, though, that's 130 points a model. I don't think it's worth it, but I think it is cool. And if you really want to use Firestrike Servo-Turrets aggressively, quote unquote, I think that's how I would do it. I should mention also that this unit doesn't have core, so it doesn't benefit from almost any of your rerolls or anything like that. Fortunately, it does have that 2+ ballistic skill. So one thing that we've talked about in the past when discussing non-core units like this is trying to source a reroll to hit or a bonus to hit, a +1 to hit to get them to that 2+ ballistic skill, so you don't need the rerolls quite as much. This thing just has it built in, so you don't need to try to get +1 to hit on them. They'll just do it by themselves. And that makes them relatively self-sufficient. So as we're moving on into this video, I'm going to talk less about specific buffs that you can put on them to make them hit more reliably. And I'm going to talk more about global sort of passive synergies that work well with them. And I think there's actually a couple surprising ones in here. So let's move on and start talking about the individual Space Marine chapters that you could get some decent use out of a Firestrike Servo-Turret with. Now, the first one is if you're taking any of these individual single model units, any reroll effects, for example, the Salamander's Fortune Battle reroll 1 wound roll trait, or Master Artisans to reroll 1 hit roll, those are always going to be good. So if you're running a couple of these, having either of those chapter tactics is excellent. Salamanders also benefit pretty well from a 2+ save. Because of that, ignore AP1. You're never going to get to that 3+ save. You're always going to be taking it on a 2 if they're hitting you with AP1 weapons, which is just nice to have. Looking at some other chapters that could work well with these guys, Iron Hands in the Devastator Doctrine lets them reroll 1s to hit, which means you're almost at 100% conversion rate on your hit rolls. A couple of these things, shooting those 6 autocannon shots, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, means you're probably going to hit with all 6 of them, which is very reliable. That's very nice. Dark Angels can give them extra range in the Devastator Doctrine. They can use Brilliant Strategists to move them back to Devastator Doctrine if you really want that extra range for an extra turn. I think there are so many better uses for that ability that I don't think I would be building that into your list, but it is something you could do if you really want to shoot a 30-inch Las Talon. The Imperial Fist's Super Doctrine actually works really well with autocannon equivalent weapons. It means that any Strength 7 weapon or above, it gets +1 damage when hitting a vehicle. So, taking the Accelerator autocannon variant of these can put a lot of 3 damage shooting downrange, and that does become AP2 in the Devastator Doctrine as well, so that's nothing to shake a stick at. Imperial Fists also have access to Tank Hunters, so if you are targeting a vehicle with a unit of 3 of these with autocannons, that's 18 shots hitting on 2s, probably wounding on 4s or 5s, rerolling everything, and hitting for a flat 3 damage. That is a lot of damage output. It is also very expensive and not very flexible, because it's Devastator Doctrine, and these things can't really move very far. Your opponent can just stay out of their line of sight, and you only get 1 chance to use that, so it's not actually that good, but it can push some serious damage through in the right situations. Interestingly, I think one of the best passive effects for these is actually the Raven Guard chapter tactic. It makes 0 sense that Raven Guard would be using servo turrets. They're all about hit and run tactic, espionage, and maneuver warfare, and so putting a stationary gun turret on the table for them makes no sense at all. But it does give them light cover when they're more than 18 inches away from their attacker. Given that this is an artillery piece and will probably spend almost the entirety of the game in or around your deployment zone, I think almost every time it gets attacked, it's going to be 18 inches away. And bringing a 2+ save down to a 1+ save is a really big swing. That means that it basically gets to ignore AP1 all the time. It's always going to be saving on 2s. And even like a las cannon hitting it for AP3 only brings it to a 4+ save. It's going to shake half of the las cannons that hit it. That's also a passive effect that's in play for the entire game. It's not tied to a super doctrine or something like that. So I do think that that's actually a very interesting place to put these guys. Raven Guard also tend to kind of front load a lot of their threats. They want to infiltrate up into your deployment zone and play very aggressively. So having a couple relatively meaty units sitting back in their deployment zone, sitting on objectives, doesn't sound too bad. Now that said, there aren't too many specific abilities that synergize very well with these. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times when we're talking about non-core vehicles, we're trying to get +1 to hit on them, and they already hit on a ballistic skill too. So you don't need any Signum Arrays or Primaris Tech Marines standing next to them, making them more efficient. There's also, not that many stratagems that really work well with them. And especially if you're taking individuals, using stratagems on them is relatively inefficient. So generally speaking, you're going to want them to be pretty self-sufficient. So with that, let's move on to a final verdict and talk about the value of a Firestrike Servo-Turret and how it compares with the rest of the Space Marine faction. Now, I mentioned before, this is probably going to be a little bit of a negative analysis, so let's just rip this band-aid off real quick. Would I take a Firestrike Servo-Turret in a Space Marine army? Almost never. I don't think I would ever take one. Honestly, if I were to design a datasheet around the premise of it being almost completely unplayable, this is pretty close to what it would look like. Warhammer 40,000 is a game about standing on objectives and moving aggressively up the table to take board space, and servo turrets just don't do that. They can hold existing space, but they don't actually move up. And if your opponent is moving aggressively at them, there's nothing they can do about it. They're just going to shoot you, and if you charge them, they'll probably just die. That's all they're doing. That would be okay if they were points efficient and you just wanted to use them as sort of an attrition engine to continue to shave off your opponent's models as they were fighting around the center of the table. But at almost 100 points apiece, they just don't put out enough damage for that to be worth it, nor are they survivable enough to let you hold objectives without worrying about it. The cost with the last Talons especially is astronomical to me. 130 points for a single model that shoots 4 shots at 24-inch range is way too many points. If you want to bring a full unit of them and do something interesting, like I mentioned before, maybe strategic reserving them, it costs more than a repulsor. You could just bring an executioner for that. We talked about Gladiator Valiant in the last video, and that tank is 150 points less than bringing 3 of these servo turrets. It only shoots 8 times rather than the full 12, but it does have a couple Meltagons on there, which typically deal a little bit more damage, so I think they're relatively equivalent in damage output, plus you can equip Icarus arrays and things like that on top of that tank, and it has the smokescreen keyword, so it's harder to kill. It's toughness 8. It has almost the same number of wounds. It's just better in every metric, and I still don't even think a Gladiator Valiant is that playable. While we're talking about comparisons, let's talk about the battlefield role that the Firestrike Servo-Turret is in. I kind of assumed when I was looking at this datasheet that it would be in fast attack, given that, even though it's not very fast, Games Workshop likes to put a lot of random gun turret type weapons in fast attack. Tarantulas, most famously, I think, have been in fast attack for a long time, and fast attack in the Space Marine Army is generally a pretty open battlefield role. Elites are where all the dreadnoughts and special support characters live, so those are usually pretty highly contentious, and heavy support has things like whirlwinds and eradicators, which are also very valuable. But fast attack, I mean, you kind of have some land speeders sometimes, and maybe some ATVs, but usually the fast attack slots are a little bit more flexible. The fact that this is in heavy support means it's competing directly with eradicators. Why would you ever take this over an eradicator? In a single battalion list, you only have 3 heavy support slots to play with, and wasting one of them on one of these servo turrets seems like such a downgrade from one of the other, not significantly more expensive units you could put in there. And looking at their points cost specifically, there are some really damning comparisons elsewhere in the Codex. For example, they compete basically directly with Stalkers, the anti-aircraft autocannon vehicle. And taking a Stalker instead of one of these things gives you the same number of autocannon shots, but the Stalker has upside in that its autocannons are much better at killing aircraft. The Stalker also has 6 more wounds than a single Firestrike turret, 3 more toughness, and smokescreen. For just 25 points, that is a bargain. You lose, I guess, the 2+ ballistic skill, but you can source that elsewhere. In comparison, I don't think that's that big a deal with all of the other benefits that the Stalker brings with it. Suppressors are in fast attack themselves and are only 100 points, 10 points more than the autocannon variety of the servo turret, and gets you 3 additional shots, the infantry keyword, the ability to deep strike, the smokescreen keyword, and more base wounds. The fact that they're infantry means a lot of times they'll be in a 2+ save because they can benefit from light cover from terrain more often, and smokescreen and more total wounds makes them inarguably more difficult to kill than this servo turret. This thing is probably like somewhere in the realm of 20 points too expensive. It's insane. If the datasheet were to be reworked, I do think there's some interesting design space that you could expand into. I mentioned before that they're described as using grav pads to move around the table, so why that isn't represented mechanically in the game at all sort of blows my mind. You could just give give them the repulsor field keyword and they could use Grav Pulse, which would be sweet. That would be even more useful if you gave them like a scout ability where they could deploy centrally in the table and maybe actually use those Las Talons. Then that makes Grav Pulse even more important because if your opponent's trying to charge them early game, you can make those charges very difficult. That's actually a really interesting archetype of a unit and not one that Space Marines have access to yet, but I don't know, they just don't do that, I guess. Alternatively, you could give them the ability to like Deep Strike or something. Maybe their Grav Pulse could let them pick up off the table and then Deep Strike the next movement phase. So as long as they take a turn off, they could show up elsewhere on the table where they have line of sight to enemies. That could also be interesting. You could also just make them way less expensive. Any one of those would make this, I think, a playable unit. But unfortunately, with the datasheet it has right now, I can't really imagine anyone putting one in their list. So for all those reasons, the final verdict is a big old fail for the Firestrike Servo-Turrets. So that's going to be it for this review and analysis in this datasheet deep dive of this weird little unit. Even when it was previewed, it felt like a very bizarre model to me, given that Space Marines are described as being these kind of hit-and-run shock troopers, that they're like special forces that perform surgical strikes and kind of come screaming in from their battle barges to hit and retreat very quickly, doing lightning-fast raids on their enemy to leave them off balance. Setting up stationary gun platforms to hold static ground never really felt like it was part of the Space Marine MO to me. I mean, I guess you might as well keep some on the battle barge just in case you need to like secure your FOB or something. And I guess Imperial Fists exist for a reason, but it didn't ever feel like it fit to the background too much. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review and learned some interesting things about the Firestrike Servo-Turret. Big thanks to all my patrons. You can find them at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise or on the screen right here where you can see all of their names. They get all sorts of cool benefits for supporting me on Patreon, and they help me make all these videos and do all the other cool stuff that I do for Tactical Tortoise. If you want to support the channel, please consider being a patron and or joining our new YouTube membership program. You can find the join link down beneath the video right next to where you would subscribe. You get some cool benefits for signing up to that as well. You get a little badge for your YouTube profile for our comment section and chats. You also unlock a bunch of emojis you can use on our videos, which is sick. We just need a couple more people to sign up and we get to unlock another batch of emojis. I have them ready to go in the chamber as soon as we get a couple more members. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Hope everyone enjoyed this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.